I wanted to talk about why wilderness fire matters from a scientist's perspective. So we have the Wilderness Act, which we're supposed to be managing for, and there are a variety of things that we often talk about, like naturalness and untrammeled and solitude, unconfined recreation. But wilderness is also supposed to be managed for its scientific and educational purposes. It has a lot of value there. And so it really is the best place that we have for, as a natural laboratory for fire, to watch it take place across the landscape. Wilderness fire is, we allow it to operate in natural ecosystems without as many human influences as we have on other lands. So that helps us sort out what is really going on. Where it allows us to study the effects of fire that burn under all conditions of fire spread, not just the extreme conditions that escape our ability to suppress. And it allows us to see the results of those multiple repeated fires, those second entry, those third entry burns. We get to watch fire operate at natural intervals on the landscape. And so fortunately, from my perspective as a scientist, we've had this great wilderness fire experiment that wilderness fire managers have been conducting in a few places around the country. And the Bob is a big one. The Northern Rockies, in fact, is a real center with the Selway Bitterroot and Frank Church and even Yellowstone to some degree. There are other places, not many, but where we have these 20, 30-year histories, 40 years, where we've been able to see this experiment take place. And so there's a whole host of things that we've learned. One of the things which I forgot to put in a slide on, we've learned, because we've been allowing fires to burn, we've learned that wilderness visitors actually can really change their perception about fire when they start seeing it on the ground. That's one thing that we learned because we had this experiment taking place. We've also been able to test hypotheses about soil nitrogen dynamics, and we've learned that, yes, indeed, places where we allow recurrent fires to burn have a higher nitrogen availability. A lot of that points to charcoal, which you're going to be getting a good lesson on with Deb later. We've been able to dismiss some criticisms that were being made about fire history methods that use tree rings to reconstruct the past. There was a lot of criticism about those samples not being randomly distributed on the landscape or systematically distributed on the landscape, because when you're looking for a fire-scarred tree, you just take what you have. Well, because we've been letting fires burn, we've had maps to compare the fire history record, the tree ring record with, and determined that yes, the tree ring record is pretty accurate. Because we haven't been salvage logging the snags that are created by fire, we've been able to see how long snags stay on the landscape and whether or not they survive through repeated fires. And that was only possible because we had a wilderness fire program. We've been able to document just how resistant those old trees can be to fire, even when they sustain a lot of injury from fire. And a study here in Big Prairie and White River Park has monitored the longevity of those trees through repeated fires here. And we've discovered that fires can sort of restore the natural trajectory, successional trajectory of some of these places where even after a really long period of fire exclusion, when fires are reintroduced, so an example from Andrew Larson conducted here in the Bob was after the first fire, after a long period of exclusion, after the first fire, thick lodgepole pine had established, and the thinking was that, well, that's just going to set up the system into a high severity lodgepole pine system, where actually if we had that repeated fire come in just 10 years later, 8 to 10 years later, we could reset that trajectory back toward that mixed conifer dynamic. And similarly, we've learned that the effect that repeated fires have on developing these resistant and resilient forest structures, reducing tree densities, keeping seedling densities low. And then we've been able to really quantify the effect that these previous burns have on the landscape in terms of serving as a fuel break, and been able to quantify the amount of time that that fuel treatment effect lasts on the landscape, and the role that extreme weather can play in diminishing that effect. And these are lessons that can be applied outside of wilderness and are being taken outside of wilderness, that previous burns can slow down fire and curb fire spread. They can reduce the severity when they do burn, and they can also reduce the number of fires that even start in the first place. Because when if there's not enough available fuels to start a fire, a lightning strike doesn't result in that need for initial attack. So it's a great story to be able to tell that can be applied to non-wilderness lands. And then we've also, because of these repeated fires, we've been able to start to see some of the complexity of these reburn dynamics that I think we'll be hearing about later today too. So why do wilderness fires matter from a scientist perspective? Well, we have these attributes of wilderness fires that give this real value to science. So because they occur in these natural ecosystems without a whole lot of human influence, they provide a really good benchmark for understanding how natural fire regimes work, and we can apply those lessons everywhere. These fires occur in all conditions of fire spread, and that increases the range of variation in the data that we have, which allows us to really see relationships between factors and see describe processes. And because wilderness fires, if you have a wilderness fire program that has longevity to it, we see these multiple repeated fires that burn under these with these natural fire intervals, and that gives us a chance to see the dynamics of the ecosystems play out, and we can learn a lot. So I'm going to just switch gears as I wrap up here, and just talk about why every wilderness fire management decision makes a difference, why that matters. And that's because every single decision has the potential to really go a long way. I spent a couple of years doing a study to see, okay, can we use some fire spread models to reconstruct where fires would have spread if we had not suppressed them? And I did this for a period of just like 11 years, 11 years worth of ignitions in some study areas in the Sierra Nevada to see just how far those fires would have gone, and then what would have happened the next year. And so recreated these fires and just learned that, God, these management decisions to suppress take so much fire out of the system, there would have been, the landscape would have looked enormously different. And that period of time, you know, it's just one superintendent's, you know, one tenure of a superintendent, you know, in that period of time can have a huge impact on the landscape. But if those fires hadn't been suppressed, there actually would have been less of a need for initial attack in a lot of cases, and that a lot of fires wouldn't have been so destructive. And yet, we know that fires are suppressed, right? A whole host of reasons. There's a whole variety of risks that need to be mitigated. That's where, you know, a lot of the politics come in. We have internal factors. You know, is your staff up to speed? Do we have enough people? You know, are people working together well? A whole bunch of external factors, public support, trails, all of that. And so we've asked managers over the years, you know, what are your real factors that are influencing this go, no-go decision on wilderness fire? And we found out, you know, all of these things. But the one thing that has really impressed me the most is this factor regarding stewardship. And this was really well shown by a paper done by a graduate student at the time, Martha Williamson, who grew up to be a line officer. She interviewed in 3 Forest Service regions district rangers that had wilderness responsibility, what their constraints were when they were managing wilderness fire. And she learned a lot about all of these constraints. But then she also asked whether or not they had authorized WFU at the time, wildland fire use. And the one factor that differentiated people who had authorized wilderness fire, had actually let a fire burn, and those that didn't, the primary distinguishing factor was this expressed personal commitment to wildland fire use. That came out strongly in her analysis, and I've seen it and I've heard it from a whole bunch of people, including Mike, a bunch of people here in this room, a bunch of people up there on that screen. And you hear from them things like, well, yeah, it's the right thing to do. It's something that we have to do. And because we were doing it for wilderness, it got us through all of the other constraints and barriers that we had to work through. Not all of these people up here on this slide, not all these people that I'm thinking about in this room were necessarily line officers. They didn't necessarily have that personal authority to say go or no go. There were fire management officers, they were rec staff, they were front desk people, because everybody, for a wilderness fire program to work, I think everybody has to be involved. Everybody has a part to play. And so, look in the mirror. You may be a wilderness fire steward, whether or not you have that decision in your back pocket.